Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has been carrying out a reshuffle of her cabinet with a few new faces, but so far the changes appear limited. The Immigration Minister, Brandon Lewis, has been named as the new Conservative Party chairman, with Jeremy Hunt continuing as Health Secretary. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, is also staying put. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has the latest. Her report contains flashing images.
Who is going where? This was more a reshuffle where ministers inched out or moved along a little. No huge group of brand new passengers for the glossy Downing Street cars. The most powerful stayed more or less in place.
Are you expecting to stay in post, Mr Johnson?
The Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor, Brexit Secretary and the Home Secretary, all still the same.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
David Lidington, who had been in charge of the legal system, was promoted to become an enforcer across government. Sajid Javid, the Community Secretary, had housing added to his title, but stays in place. Some of Downing Street's decisions were not anyone's choice. The Northern Ireland Secretary, James Brokenshire, has stood aside for health reasons.
My intent is to get on with surgery, get on with recovery and get back to my duties as MP for Old Bexley and Sidcup, and also back to frontline political duties as well.
By standing alongside them, this is what the Prime Minister really wanted you to see today.
Will this broaden the party's appeal?
New faces to reboot the Tory machine after its bungled election campaign.
Honoured and looking forward to getting on with the job.
A new chair and a bigger team appointed by number 10 to take charge at Tory HQ.
I'm very honoured and proud the Prime Minister asked me to lead a great party. We've got a great team, great professionals, great colleagues and volunteers. Looking forward to taking that forward.
We've got a fantastic team. Really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Do you think you can really deliver the kind of thing that the Prime Minister hopes for? The Tories have been way behind.
Absolutely. This is such a positive move.
There's a lot to do, but we're ready for it.
There are always challenges, but we're up for it.
You may well not recognise Tory HQ. You may well never have seen some of the new faces. But this reshuffle is about rebooting this party, as well as about what happens in government. But watch this. Those who seemed likely to move, like the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, followed by the Business Secretary, Greg Clark, both arrived into number 10 and stayed until after dark and emerged with virtually the same jobs.
Are you pleased with your new job?
But a colleague, David Gauke, did move to Justice. Karen Bradley, the new Northern Ireland Secretary, and Justine Greening, expected to switch from schools any moment now. And with more moves expected in the next couple of hours, there will be new faces around this table tomorrow. Reassuringly, though, neither a move nor a vacancy exists for the Downing Street cat.
And Laura joins us now. So, Laura, has the Prime Minister got what she wanted in this reshuffle?
Well, Sophie, it wouldn't be a reshuffle if there weren't bits and pieces of confusion around the edges or expectations that turned out to be wrong. I understand, for example, that Jeremy Hunt stayed in his position at the Department for Health because he made a strong and passionate argument to the Prime Minister that he was the man to do so and to take on responsibility for the future of social care in England. So things were perhaps a bit fluid around Mr Hunt, and he talked himself into staying into his own job, having persuaded the Prime Minister. And so far, you know, this reshuffle is still going on. So far, this is a set of moves, a slight change, people moving in and out. But the crucial thing is that the four most senior jobs in government, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor and the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, they have all stayed in their post. So in terms of a grand big New Year clear out, it is not that. But for number 10's point of view, they say by the end of tonight we'll have a new look cabinet, and then by the end of tomorrow there will be many more new appointments, more women and more ethnic minority MPs coming into government. And they are clear that this is a significant reshuffle. It's not just a few tweaks around the edges. for any Prime Minister, getting through one of these without a big mistake or some huge big mess up is something of an achievement. But Downing Street are adamant this is a new look. But as I say, without huge changes at the top table, it's not necessarily the kind of reshuffle that will go down in history.
Laura Koonsberg, thank you.
Theresa May has spent the day reshuffling her cabinet, but not that much of it. The government big hitters have kept their jobs, and only a handful of cabinet ministers have moved or left the government altogether. In fact, the biggest changes came at Conservative Party headquarters. Former Immigration Minister Brandon Lewis has been made Conservative Party chairman, with a new team of deputies tasked with reinvigorating the Tory campaign machine. Our political editor Gary Gibbon joins us live now from Downing Street. Gary.
Well, we were told this reshuffle was all about refreshing the team, making it look more like the rest of the country, new faces, new vigour. The truth is, when the Cabinet meets tomorrow, an awful lot of them will be bumping into some extremely familiar faces. Oh, you again. And actually, it looks at the moment as though there may be no forced departures from the Cabinet. We can't be entirely sure yet, but it looks as though that may be the case. Aides to Theresa May are saying, but wait until you see the other changes in government, in the middle ranks, in the lower ranks. When she gets round to those tomorrow, you'll see new faces, a new generation, as it were, coming in. Well, that word wait is quite key there, because today things have gone on longer than were planned. Tomorrow could be equally tricky, and it looks as though in some cases ministers have slightly dug in their heels and were being told to swap chairs even if they stayed at the table, but weren't happy to do that. One of them, it seems, could be Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, who wasn't happy with the idea of moving. Anyway, here's how the day went here. It had been heavily trailed as a reshuffle to refresh government, make it look more like the rest of society. And this morning, Theresa May posed with her new team. But these are officers of the Tory party. Some may be on the way to real government jobs. 3 of them got these posts as compensation for losing their ministerial jobs. This is not the new look government, which so far looks a lot like the old one.
Downing Street has just sent out this message of our Twitter. There we are. David Davis, MP, remains Secretary of State for exiting the European Union.
The minister responsible for local government and housing, Sajid Javid, emerged with pretty much the same job, but a newly renamed ministry. And that was how much of the day went. After nearly 2 hours inside Number 10, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, emerged.
Are you happy with your new
Still
position,
Health Secretary, but with responsibility for social care, now resting in his department.
Boris Johnson, you remember, we told you that he had gone into Number 10 just a short time ago. We're hearing that he will be remaining as the Foreign Secretary.
Ministers who thought Theresa May wanted to get rid of them if she'd got a big majority in last summer's election are still there. Mrs May doesn't have the clout to shuffle her top team much at all. One departure was the Northern Ireland Secretary, James Brokenshire. He announced he's about to have an operation on one of his lungs and is leaving government for health reasons.
I have a small lesion in my right lung that will require surgery to remove. Whilst the health team believe that that will deal with the issue and that I'll be back to work, it will take a number of weeks and time where I'll need to be away from duties and work.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin's resignation as Conservative Party chairman created an opening. Conservative Central Office tweeted out congratulations to Chris Grayling for getting the job, only for the tweet to be withdrawn as Brandon Lewis, formerly Immigration Minister, turned up and was given the post.
Mr. Lewis, are you the new party chairman?
Theresa May hopes that when you see the full lineup of her ministerial team beyond the cabinet, rather than just the full team of Tory party vice chairs, it'll look a bit more like the rest of the country, aides said. A bit younger, a bit fresher.
There's a lot to do, but we're ready for it. We're going to go and do it.
Kim, what about you, Kim? How big do you think the challenge is?
I agree with Ben. There are always challenges, but we're up for it.
Damien Green's departure from office before Christmas made this reshuffle unavoidable. The Prime Minister needed a new deputy to drive domestic policy and chair key Brexit committees. She's decided to give that job to ardent Remain supporter and former Europe Minister David Lidington. And the key thing there was that the Prime Minister didn't want to destabilise the balance, in that case Brexit, Remain in her cabinet. She doesn't really feel she's got an enormous amount of manoeuvre for major structural changes here. And I think one of the things you see again with that is Chris Grayling, the Transport Secretary, leaving. His job is intact. He's staying where he was, despite some pressures for him to move. And a moment earlier, Liam Fox just left, International Trade Minister. He's going to carry on building up the air miles, staying in that job. Two new appointments that are quite interesting. A moment ago, the new Secretary for Culture, Matt Hancock, virtually skipped down the road, looking extremely happy. He was a protege of George Osborne once, which shows there is some forgiveness in political life. And another new appointment, Karen Bradley, who was Culture Secretary, is going to be the Northern Ireland Secretary at what could be a very challenging time. If direct rule comes back, someone without experience of the province could find themselves in a very hot seat.
Gary, thanks very much. Well, Jeremy Hunt has kept his job. In fact, he's added to it with a new health and social care title. Our own health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald, is with me. So does this new job title, catching up with yours, reflect a new government priority?
Yes, well, I can only congratulate the government on catching up with me. He is now going to be called the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and what people are hoping is that this does signal an increased interest in social care. Now, what we have seen over the past few weeks is this terrible pressures building up in the NHS, and they are almost all of them caused, not entirely, but almost all of them caused by the fact that people get blocked in beds. They get stuck there because there isn't enough social care in the community. So there is a lot of Twitter sphere action saying we really hope that the government now is going to do something with this, because he has obviously asked for this his job to be expanded.
But in the meantime, he's still got to deal with the funding crisis, the winter crisis in the NHS.
Well, it's interesting that if the rumours are true that he turned down business secretary and would rather stay at health. Of course, there was another rumour that he was going to be made the sort of de facto prime minister. But yes, he does have to deal... Deputy prime minister, yes. He does have to deal with really one of the hardest times that the NHS has seen in a very long time. He didn't get as much funding as had been hoped for in the budget. There isn't much room for manoeuvre, and there is the social care crisis that means that nearly half the beds in the NHS now are thought to be taken up by people who really should not be there, and that is a huge issue for him to have to deal with over the next few weeks.
And you'll be watching it all like a hawk.
I will.
Victoria, thanks very much. Tonight's main news, a cabinet reshuffle which has left most familiar faces in place, with the biggest shake-up at Tory central office. Gary Gibbon is in Downing Street with the latest. Gary, we've just had the first casualty of the reshuffle, haven't we?
Yes, an extraordinary standoff was happening in Downing Street for more than 2 hours behind me. Justine Greening, the Education Secretary, was in there and was trying to hold on to her job. And Theresa May was trying to prise her fingers off the job. She was willing to give her another cabinet job. She was willing to give her Department for Work and Pensions, not an inconsiderable job. Justine Greening just kept saying no. She'd seen Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, earlier say no to a move and managed to get his way. Maybe she was emboldened by that. But in the end, she lost that bout. She is now out of the government, potentially a troublemaker on the backbenches, a London pro-Remain constituency, maybe, as it were, a new Nicky Morgan in the making. And overall today, you look at what Theresa May has achieved with her attempted reshuffle, and the word refresh, which was the one we were promised, does not come to mind. A word that was used by one of her closest aides of the past recently was, it looks like a complete shambles.
Gary, thanks very much. More all night on Twitter on that.
It is often said that a cabinet reshuffle is a chance to reassert a Prime Minister's authority and refresh a party's image. Well, after the comings and a few goings at Downing Street today, it is perhaps fair to ask whether Mrs May's cabinet reshuffle has achieved either of those things. In fact, one might even gingerly say it all looked like a bit of a shambles. Education Secretary Justine Greening refused to move and walked out of government. Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt appeared to talk the Prime Minister out of moving him. A novel tactic when facing the sack or the shunt, it must be said, and worth bearing in mind. Meanwhile, over at Conservative headquarters, the party tweeted out its congratulations to Chris Grayling on becoming its new chairman. Yes, indeed, except the job actually went to Brandon Lewis, the Immigration Minister. It felt, I'm afraid, like it was just one of those days.
Behind the curtains, the Prime Minister trying to persuade her Education Secretary, Justine Greening, to move to Work and Pensions, in talks lasting 2 hours. Greening turned her down, bounded out to return to the back benches, claiming that her ministerial career was less important than campaigning to help people better themselves.
Will this reshuffle rejuvenate the party?
It wasn't the fresh start for the Prime Minister, a reassertion of authority that she'd hoped this reorganisation of her cabinet would be. There were whoopsies from the start. It had been an open secret for some time that this man, Patrick McLaughlin, was on his way out as Tory party chairman following the debacle for his party of last year's election. But what was a surprise was this tweet by Tory HQ welcoming Chris Grayling as McLaughlin's successor. It was a bit premature because, in fact, the Prime Minister was in the process of appointing the Immigration Minister, Brandon Lewis, as the party's new chairman.
Honoured and looking forward to getting on with the job.
With James Cleverly as his deputy.
Really looking forward to this. Thank you.
And Ben Bradley and Kemi Badenoch, who's been an MP for less than a year, as vice chairs.
There are always challenges, but we're up for it.
In the end, what was supposed to be a remaking of Theresa May's team in her own image changed fairly little. All the top ministers, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary and Brexit Minister, stayed in post. Damien Green, who resigned before Christmas, had his responsibilities taken by another close ally of the Prime Minister, David Lidington, but unlike Green, he won't be the number 2 in the cabinet. Sajid Javid stayed in post, but the word housing was added to the name of his department. And the other important changes were Esther McVeigh going to the Department of Work and Pensions, David Gauke as the new Lord Chancellor, Damien Hines replacing Justin Greening at Education, Karen Bradley going to Northern Ireland, and Matthew Hancock replacing Bradley at Culture, Media and Sport. It wasn't just Greening who'd said no to the PM. Earlier, Jeremy Hunt had refused to move from health to business, but unlike Greening, he actually persuaded Theresa May to let him stay and give him yet more responsibilities for sorting out the funding crisis in social care for the elderly. Not all the cabinet changes were judgments on individual competence and success. The Northern Ireland Secretary, James Brokenshire, decided to quit because he needs an operation on his lung.
My intent is to get on with surgery, get on with recovery and get back to my duties as MP for Old Bexley and Sidcup and also back to frontline political duties as well.
To make a bad day of anything worse for the Prime Minister, the leader of the Scottish Tories, Ruth Davidson, tonight tweeted how sorry she was that Greening had gone and what a great role model she'd been. Occupants of this place normally hope that reshuffles are demonstrations of their naked power to hire and fire. Theresa May, with a party split over Brexit and no majority in Parliament, isn't the first to find that moving ministers up, down and out can be tricky.
And Robert joins us now from Downing Street. Robert, to cut to the quick here, what on earth has been going on there today?
Well, look, this was supposed to be a reshuffle that reinvigorated Theresa May's domestic policies, in particular sorting out the housing crisis and the shortage of funding for health and social care. Now, quite how adding the word housing to the communities and local government's name sorts out a shortage of housing, quite how starting the day by thinking you're going to move your health secretary and then at the end of the day being persuaded by him to let him stay in health and take over responsibility for sorting out the funding of social care, how that indeed pursues that aim of reinvigorating those domestic policies, frankly, most people won't be able to fathom. Now, the point is, this was not a hurried or rushed reshuffle. It was precipitated by the sacking of Damien Green before Christmas. They had plenty of time to square off ministers like Justin Greening and Jeremy Hunt, and Theresa May and her colleagues singularly failed. This was supposed to be, as I say, a reshuffle to reinvigorate domestic policy, but also show that this is a Prime Minister not just in office, but also in power. I'm not sure Theresa May has succeeded in doing that today.
Well, Robert, it looks like 2018 is going to be another interesting year in politics. For now, thank you very much indeed. So the Prime Minister has chosen new ministers and yesterday, of course, dropped a manifesto promise on fox hunting in an attempt to start shifting perceptions, some of the perceptions Robert was just talking about there. It is tempting to give her some credit for just ploughing on regardless, perhaps, but is that how swing voters see it? In a word, no.
It's not just her party that Theresa May has to win over with this reshuffle. It's the voters. To understand what she's up against ahead of the reshuffle, we sat in on 2 swing voter focus groups put together for the pollsters Britain Thinks. An older group of Conservative-leaning voters and a younger group of Labour-leaning ones. And what they have to say about Theresa May will not make comfortable listening for the Prime Minister.
I thought she was going to be brilliant, but the way she handled her election run-up was just disastrous.
I think they've put Theresa May in charge to think that everyone will think, oh look, another Mrs Thatcher, and she, you know, she's not a patch on her.
I just seem to turn off when she comes on the television. I don't. She doesn't make me want to listen to what she's saying.
So she's not sort of like not charismatic.
No,
or...
and I've always been a Conservative.
Ouch.
Since I was 18.
Slightly less surprisingly, the younger group weren't keen on Mrs May either.
Meek. Self-centred.
Why self-centred?
I think she's enjoying having the power too much. She's not thinking about the country.
The 2 groups agreed public services like the NHS are struggling. The younger voters thought the main problem was money.
Very pessimistic.
Very pessimistic?
Yeah.
Why is that?
There's just too much debt that the NHS are building up.
My friend's a fireman, and me as a painter, I'm not complaining, but I earn more money than what he does as a fireman, and he's risking his life every day. And I think that's crazy.
But the older voters placed more blame on a growing, ageing population.
Too many people come into the country, causing more demand, and not just people coming into the country, people from this country.
Nobody has prepared for the fact that, as you said, we have a much older population now.
So what about the political alternative? What do they think about Jeremy Corbyn? Well, the younger group liked him.
At the end of the day, I just feel like he can't do no worse than what's happening at the moment, so why not give him the chance?
And the older group were more sceptical.
He's trying to get the vote of the youngsters by saying that university fees and all the rest of it. But I mean, we can't afford it.
But here's the kicker. As much as the older group mistrusted Jeremy Corbyn, they were still ready to vote for him.
Who put Theresa May? And who put Jeremy Corbyn? Interesting.
And the weaker May's got, in my opinion, I think he's got stronger.
Whether you believe in what he has to say, you'd be clear about what it was.
Yeah.
And I'm not clear about what Theresa May has to say.
I don't like Jeremy Corbyn either because he'll say some of the policies he has, but I think he would be a stronger leader than Theresa May.
And that should really worry the Prime Minister. Carl Dinnan, News at 10.
Depressing watching for Downing Street, I would imagine.
A lot of government reshuffles don't go smoothly. Today's was no exception. There was the tweeting of Chris Grayling's elevation to chairman of the Conservative Party when the job in fact went to Brandon Lewis. But that on its own wouldn't make for a vintage episode of the thick of it. The real issue was that Theresa May had built this up as a major refresh and an assertion of her renewed authority. But in the end, it didn't quite live up to that expectation, partly, as it turned out, because she could not make all the changes that she wanted. So let's have a quick look at a few of the comings and goings. And the big star of the reshuffle is David Lidington. Now, he's a little-known name. He's the new Damien Green. But he won't be called the first Secretary of State or Deputy Prime Minister. He does have a big and central role as the Prime Minister's right-hand man, though. But some other notable reshuffle names were 2 men that didn't move. Jeremy Hunt, he stays in health, but gets a bigger departmental name, Health and Social Care. And then Greg Clark is going to stay at the business department, despite there being a lot of chatter about him being kicked out. The Prime Minister tried, but couldn't reshuffle or swap those 2 round. Nor could she get the Education Secretary, Justine Greening, where she wanted. She has gone from Cabinet after refusing to move from Education to the Work and Pensions Department. DWP, as it's called, now goes to Esther McVeigh, who's a one-time TV presenter who has worked as a junior minister in that department. Well, our political editor, Nick Watt, is with me. To me, Nick, it seems like a lot of people are resisting the kind of plans that Theresa May had for them. An unusual number of those affected by that?
Yes, I mean, it has happened in the past that ministers say, I don't want to move, and a weak Prime Minister caves, and a strong Prime Minister says no. So today, in a sense, was a score draw for Theresa May, because she said yes to Jeremy Hunt, who wanted to stay at Health, but she said no to Justine Greening, who wanted to remain at Education, and she said no to the Department for Work and Pensions. But Tory MPs are this evening being pretty critical of Theresa May. They're saying that she started out, as Michael Howard said this morning, strong and able to do what she wanted, and by this evening showing that perhaps she can't fully assert her authority. But on day 2 of the reshuffle tomorrow, that's the junior and the middle ranks, we are told we will see many more women, many younger people and lots more Tory MPs from black and minority ethnic background, and crucially the number of women attending cabinet goes up from 8 to 10.
8 to 10. OK, David Lidington, big Euro fan. I mean, he's a known Remainer, and he's got this key role now.
That's right. He has the Damien Green job, but as you say, minus the title and minus social care. What is that job? It is chairing a series of cabinet committees on Brexit and domestic policy in the areas where the Prime Minister is not so focused, so she can absolutely focus on the Brexit negotiations and on the domestic policy of sort of national security and the economy. Now, he hasn't got the First Secretary of State title, and ministers who've gone to the Cabinet Office with a great fanfare, if they don't have something to tell Whitehall they are a big beast, they normally run into trouble. But David Lidington has 2 things that tell Whitehall he's a big beast. David Lidington, he's well known and he's well respected. So I've been looking at this very long day that didn't quite go to plan. It has been a torrid 6 months for Theresa May. Today was the moment for the Prime Minister finally to assert her authority over her government and party after the disastrous general election setback. It all started so well when the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street to show off the new group of MPs she hopes will rejuvenate the Conservative Party. But as the day wore on, the reshuffle stuttered, and this evening the Prime Minister was shaken by the surprise resignation of Justine Greening.
Did you turn down a move, Miss Greening?
Who spurned the offer of a move to the Department for Work and Pensions during a 2-hour visit to number 10. I understand Theresa May and Justine Greening have had a troubled relationship. One person who knows the Prime Minister's mind told me that she never really believed that the outgoing Education Secretary had signed up to many of the Tories' school reforms. For her part, Justine Greening is furious with what she regarded as negative press reports about her in recent weeks. Over the weekend, she told friends that she was blaming Boris Johnson for leading the charge against her after she raised questions about the handling of Brexit in cabinet meetings. Conservative MPs are complaining to me that Theresa May has emerged diminished from this reshuffle after the resignation of Justine Greening, and because other ministers successfully resisted some of the Prime Minister's original plans. Jeremy Hunt spent more than an hour in Downing Street pleading with the Prime Minister to keep his job as Health Secretary as he resisted a proposed move to the Business Department. The Prime Minister eventually relented and finally granted him his wish to be given the additional responsibility of social care. Others say Theresa May has emerged from today unscathed.
Well, I've described her as Zebedee because she's someone who just pops up and has incredible resilience against all the odds. If you look at all the difficulties following the election, everything that's happened since, she seems to still be there, and I think she made the right decision by having a cabinet reshuffle at the beginning of the year, stamp our authority to set an agenda from day one.
The Prime Minister learnt today that shuffling the pack is always a fraught business, where a bold Theresa May sacked a series of ministers on her first day in Downing Street. 18 months later, a more timid Prime Minister trod gingerly around this most delicate process.
Nick, what there? Well, we were going to be joined now by the Conservative MP Grant Shapps, but he's been held up in Parliament. They're voting, that's what they do. So we'll move on and we'll try to get him later if the wheels of democracy start moving more quickly. Because we're going to go back to politics now, and Grant Shapps can join us. He was Tory party chairman under David Cameron, was outed last year as being the ringleader of a failed plot to remove Theresa May as Prime Minister. He's finished voting and joins us from Westminster. Very good evening to you. What was your impression of the reshuffle today? How do you think it was handled?
I'm not sure actually just having a group of colleagues who wanted to talk to the Prime Minister qualifies as a plot, but look, I thought clearly, let's be blunt, it wasn't a brilliantly executed performance with the reshuffle today. They are very difficult things to get right, as I recall from time spent when I was chairman inside Downing Street looking out. But actually buried in the reshuffle, I thought there were a couple of really good ideas, which I suspect won't quite get the coverage tomorrow, but I hope will matter in the longer run. One of which was creating a Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and I used to be Housing Minister, I always thought it was ridiculous that housing didn't have its own seat around the table as a Secretary of State at Cabinet, and that's really good. And I actually thought the other move, which is quite smart but will take some working out, is taking health, Jeremy Hunt there still, but bringing in social care, which, although not everyone will know the complexities of this, actually comes from local councils at the moment, and that means it's actually under what was communities and local government. The problem is you get this bed blocking and all these problems you hear about, and bringing those together makes sense.
I was a bit confused on both of those, because I thought housing was kind of in the DCLG, so it's just a rebranding, and I thought a lot of social care was in the Department of Health, and so that was a rebranding.
Well, on the first point, you're absolutely right, that housing was within DCLG, communities and local government. But I can say this as a fact. When you sit around that cabinet table, people respond to the thing that they think is most on your agenda. And by calling it the Ministry of Housing, I noticed they've said they'll call it a ministry rather than a department, which is kind of interesting. But by calling it Ministry of Housing, which is actually a historic name for that department, it will, I think, probably give a lot more focus to what the government says is its one of its big priorities, building more homes. So I thought there was some sense in that. And no, on social care budget, the money actually comes through the local council, local authority side of things, and that makes it complicated, and it won't be solved.
Let me move on, because I just want to ask you, do you still think, you know, where we are now, that she should step down, or do you now think it's time for her to pause? And do you think there's enough young talent to which the party and the country has been exposed, so that when there is a leadership election, they can skip a generation if they want to?
Well, look, I'll probably be more or less unique in saying what I actually think about it. My view hasn't actually changed, but nor do I think there's any point banging on about it all the time. I want Theresa May to succeed because I want the party to succeed, because I don't want to see Jeremy Corbyn's Marxist government come in and destroy lives and jobs in this country. So my view hasn't changed, but I also recognise there's a lot of great talent. And I think the other good thing today was seeing some of that talent come through, albeit that perhaps slightly odd to focus on the party changes, which is where a lot of that talent was seen. But as I say, in part because it masks a couple of very good changes, which I think will take some months and probably years to work through the system, but actually could help deliver better health and social care together and better housing in this country. So there was some good stuff, strangely buried in a reshuffle, which obviously didn't quite go to plan.
All right, Grant Shapps, thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
So this is the press preview on Sky News as we look through the newspapers as we get them here. We'll talk through those with the associate editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire, and consultant editor of the Daily Mail, Andrew Pearce. Gents, good evening.
Hello.
Before... oh, that was enthusiastic.
Stephen.
Thanks very
good
much
evening.
indeed.
Sorry,
that's
very
more
good
like
evening.
it.
Yeah,
That's more like it.
Lovely. Happy New Year.
Let's have a look through the front pages, though, to begin with. Behave you. Let's start with the Telegraph. It calls it the night of the blunt stiletto, reporting the Health Secretary refused to move to business when asked. The Metro headline, we will not be moved, saying that several other front benchers also refused to accept Mrs May's plans for them. The FT describes it as an accident-strewn reshuffle, with pro-European David Lidington appointed as her new right-hand man to be her fixer in the Cabinet. The Eye has a picture of Justine Greening, the outgoing Education Secretary, who turned down work and pensions under the headline Reshuffle Rejected. Same for the Times, calls it shambolic. The Mail has no Prime Minister as their headline. For The Guardian, May shuffle in disarray as Greening quits. The Star says a winter flu pandemic could kill up to 750,000 people in the UK this winter. The Express has a poll it's carried out which found 84% of people want foreign aid money diverted to the NHS. And The Mirror reports on the trial of a man accused of murdering a fellow gardener with a power cord from a lawnmower. So let's talk through some of those with Kevin and with Andrew. We'll kick off, gents, with the Times. Yep. Should we? Justine Greening.
Well, I think there we are. Shambolic. It just absolutely sums it up. And as the Times say, it laid bare Theresa May's lack of authority and revived questions over the competence of her administration. It was all intended to show she was back on song. She was looking forward to 2018, relaunching, strong and stable, and she just looked weak and wobbly. And yeah, she couldn't shuffle a pack of cards, never mind her ministers. Had to back off on the business secretary and the health secretary, Greg Clark and Jeremy Hunt. Greening, Justine Greening offered another job, moved from education to work and pensions. She decided to walk. A Tory party text sent out that Chris Grayling was going to be the new party chair.
27 seconds.
I mean, he didn't put a foot wrong in those 27 seconds, which is a rarity for Chris Grayling, but it was a shamble from beginning to end.
The other thing now she's done, she's clearly made a huge enemy in Justine Greening, who's not a huge figure in the parliamentary party. There's not huge support from the parliamentary party either, but she's a very pro-Remain MP. She will now, no doubt, join up with Nicky Morgan and some of those
Ken
other
Clark, Dominic
Remain MPs on the backbenches as a potential thorn in her side. But what I don't get about this reshuffle, get the tricky ones out of the way first. She didn't see Justine Greening until 5 o'clock at night. She knows she's taking her away from education. Yesterday, Justine Greening was tweeting all day, education standards are improving. She was telling everybody, I want to keep my job. So it was always going to be problematic. The woman was in number 10 for 2 hours. She should have just said, frankly, she should have done a Thatcher. You don't want to be welfare out.
It's interesting though. She backed down. She backed down for the blokes, Hunt and Clark, but not for the woman Greening. Well, but Greening is, look, when you haven't got a majority and you're relying on the DUP, you've got big votes on Europe. Also Heathrow, where Greening is against the expansion because her Putney seat is under the flight path. Potentially, you've made a big enemy of it, and I disagree with you. I think there's a lot of sympathy for Justine Greening in the parliamentary party, and quite a few MPs feel she's been badly treated. Have you, as a Tory party, traded up with Damien Hines as Education Secretary? I'm not sure you have.
There's no doubt at the election, the trade unions weaponised schools' funding cuts, and there were website studies which showed which schools had lost money, and it damaged the Tories without a doubt at the election. And there is a view that it cost the Tories seats at the election. So Greening took the rap for that. But she didn't agree the financial settlement. That was spreadsheet Phil, the Chancellor, who stays in his job, of course. But what I think the one person I think we should give some credit to, though, so Justin... God, I'm getting my names wrong again. The health secretary,
Andrew Pearce.
The health secretary, Jeremy
Don't tell him. Don't.
Stuck to his guns and said he did not want to move to business secretary. Why would he? He's a long-serving health secretary. He's doing a good job, in my view, taking a lot of the flack. As the Liberals said, he's like a bomb disposal expert. He's taken a lot of the flack away from the Tories. So they've added social care into his title, and he's going to take that on. And I think that's quite courageous of Jeremy Hunt, actually.
I don't know
and I think if he does a good job,
if he
does a good job, his leadership credentials improve.
He would, but of course it was all touted and presented. He was going to be off to the Cabinet Office, possibly First Secretary of State.
Yeah, it was touted by him.
But he knew if he went to business, that would be a demotion and be seen as a demotion, which is why he dug his...
It would. Now, nobody knows who the business secretary is, Greg Clark.
Sky's John Craig says he's the longest-serving health secretary. Nye Bevan and Norman Fowler in the 1980s have served longer, but they had social services, social security in with health. He wants to beat those records. He'll beat those records this year. I think he's been a disastrous health secretary.
Well, I don't think he's been
and
good.
Should go. And you can see this winter crisis. It's underfunding. He failed to get the money. He got about a third what
it's
Simon
Australian
Stevens.
Flu, Kevin.
He didn't cause that. He's not
flu
Australian.
yet.
It is not flu, as you know. All those people stuck in ambulances, tens of thousands between Christmas and New Year, is not flu.
Go to Wales, where the Labour has run the NHS for 10 years. They haven't hit a single NHS target since 2000. That's Labour in action in Wales for you. He never wants to admit to that.
NHS,
never does.
NHS spending in Wales is linked to NHS spending in England. To the
it's
financial
devolved.
And
it's
in Wales,
devolved.
and in Wales you have.
Devolved in
Wales, you have an industrial legacy of ill health from traditional.
It's a devolved subject, and Labour have made a monumental mess of it in Wales.
There's no doubt mistakes are made in Wales.
That's what the NHS will be like in England under Labour. We've seen it in Wales.
This is a shambolic, as the Times say, reshuffle, and not a single paper, as far as I could spot, has got a good word for it. And instead of being strong and stable, she is weak and wobbly yet again.
Of course, for your paper,
No,
Andrew.
I'm afraid not. No, well, it is chaos, and I don't know why they just... you just knew where it was going with the unfortunate tweet that Chris Grayling was the Tory chairman for 27 seconds. Whoops, no, he isn't. Where did that come from? OK, it was a blundering error, but a pretty big error.
You know,
someone had drawn up a graphic.
Yeah, and poor old Brandon Lewis, who I think will prove to be quite a good Tory chairman, utterly overshadowed, hardly getting any mentions.
Look, Cameron's, Brown's, Blair's, Major's, Thatcher's all had dodgy reshuffles.
Corbyn's lasted 4 weeks.
In opposition, you're quite right. Some of them, his first efforts were really poor.
I think his first one's still going on.
You're in power. You're trying to reassert your authority. You're trying to go forward. This is not the way to do it. She has come out of this weaker than she went in.
Should she have just left well alone? I mean, there was a lot of pressure to reshuffle.
That was the advice of Gavin Williamson, now the Defence Secretary. He survived because he replaced Michael Fallon. But when he was Chief Whip, leave it. Julian Smith, the new Chief Whip, who was the Deputy Chief Whip to Gavin Williamson, often seen as Gavin Williamson's campaign manager for the till at the top job when it comes, he thought it was a good idea to have a reshuffle. Now, having a reshuffle in itself isn't a bad idea. You have to need to refresh your team sometime, you've got to bring people on, but you've got to do it competently. Yeah. And this was absolute, total, 100% incompetence.
The Telegraph's got the sort of headline, which is... got a lot of people interested here. Just it's Night of the Blunt Stiletto. There's got to be some reference to her shoes. So.
Well, what do you know? You could argue it was sexist, except she does make great play of her shoes. So I don't believe it is, because if you do a really good reshuffle, your stiletto will be sharp. You will lose the people you want to lose. You will get people out of jobs you don't want to be in, and then get those you want in. She's just failed to do that.
The criticism again will
it's the Tory graph. They want her to succeed. They're willing her to succeed, and she's failed.
The other thing is, it'll call into question again the quality of the kitchen cabinet.
Yeah.
And of course, Justin Greening thinks she was brought down by Nick Timothy, who was the chief bottle washer in the kitchen cabinet, one of the architects of the doomed election campaign, because he's written a series of articles in the Telegraph slagging off Justin Greening.
In the days to come, and all the way up to the weekends in the Sunday papers, we'll all be poring over this. How did it happen? Who advised? And Gavin Barwell, the Chief of Staff, will have to answer questions on his role.
He still refuses to quit the headline on the inside pages of the Mirror.
And this is fun.
I think that's laudable and admirable. I mean, the Mirror will take a different view, but I think it's admirable that he's staying on in that job, because it's one of the most difficult jobs of the lot, and I think he's handled it very well.
I think he's done enough damage. Time for him to go. But he is going to stay now. He will become the longest serving. It is there. Whether the NHS can survive him, well, let's see. He already had social care. She's changed his title to health and social care. He had social care.
You think
he was running the review.
You think this is the first NHS crisis in the winter, wouldn't you? Like they never happened under Blair. They did
in the early years, and then they largely stopped because Labour put the money and the personnel and the systems in. The NHS now, the extra money it's getting is historically low levels. It's on starvation rations. Population's getting bigger. People are getting older.
Immigration.
Too
much immigration.
It's pathetic, this.
It's not pathetic.
Look, let's have a rational discussion of it instead of just scapegoating and demonising and playing.
That part of the problem with
you're more likely to meet a migrant treating you.
Massive immigration. It's a huge issue. The left won't accept it, but people know it's a fact.
Migrants have to pay for the NHS if they use it, as you will know.
A reader sent me a leaflet from the NHS of the day, 14 different languages translated on the sheet of A4 paper. Huge expense for the NHS.
And when you go abroad, you always want, whether it's French, German, Chinese, Japanese, you want it to be translated.
Put pressure on the NHS.
Well, look, your
American
thoughts
translators
on all of that at Sky Stephen. I'd love to hear your thoughts this evening. We're going to leave you two just for a moment.